to have alongside me Rob Jackson and Rich Gough, who are joining us today to talk about work they've been doing with HVG and some of the overall consultancy taking place in the sector at the moment. I'll just introduce both of them. Rob Jackson is director of Rob Jackson Consulting Limited, a consultancy and training company that helps engage and inspire people to bring about change. Rob has more than 25 years experience working in the voluntary and community sector, holding a variety of strategic development and senior management roles that are focused on leading and engaging volunteers. Since 2011, Rob has been working with a wide range of clients in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, and in North America. He is also co-author of the Complete Volunteer Manager Handbook. And Rich is director of Solders of Shropshire Museum, which is located in Shrewsbury Castle, where he has been in post since 2019. Prior to that, he was volunteering and visiting engagement manager at the Ironbridge Gorge Museum Trust, a World Heritage Site in the heart of Shropshire. Rich has been involved in sector for 22 years, working in operations behind the scenes and in volunteer management and in customer-facing roles. So a large range of experience as well. So today we're talking about two particular things. We're talking about an open letter, which Heritage Volunteering Group was involved in, and we'll be also finding out more about some of the work HVG has been doing to advocate for the sector as well. Thank you, Rob. That statement is available for download in the chat if you are interested in reading it. So I'll hand over to Rob first. So thank you both for being here today. I just wanted to sort of find out what this letter is about. So it's being addressed to senior managers and board members, so I guess key decision makers in cultural organisations and sectors as well. What's the importance of it about?
So thanks, Will, and hello everybody. Nice to see so many friendly faces on there. So where this came from actually was my belief and the belief of a few others that we were talking to as we're going through the last few weeks and months, that when it comes to organisational renewal and recovery, volunteer management, volunteer engagement professionals are going to be absolutely fundamental to organisation success. I've just come off another call that was organised by NCVO, and in the entire 50 minutes of talking about where and I think Vanessa was on it as well, in talking about where through 50 minutes of the entire future of the voluntary sector, I think the word volunteer got mentioned once in the entire session. And I think that just kind of shows how so many people in civil society organisations, including heritage sector, don't always get the strategic value of volunteering. So I was quite struck by a statement that was pulled together by an alliance of organisations in the United States that was really calling on leaders in the sector, so chief executives, boards, funders, government agencies and others, to recognise that we need to strategically invest in volunteer engagement for future success, rather than what we know normally happens when economic hardship starts to face our society and our sector, which is that volunteer engagement budgets get slashed as a way of saving money whilst fundraising and income generation gets invested in. So I was quite keen that we took that US statement and developed something that would be appropriate for the UK. So we convened a group that included Rich from HVG, the Association of Volunteer Managers, AVSM, which is the Hospice Volunteer Managers Professional Association, and Volunteer Now, which is the kind of peak body for volunteering in Northern Ireland. And we developed this letter. So as said, it's on the chat earlier on. We've subsequently had the Scottish Volunteering Forum come on board, and we've also had the NHS Volunteer Managers Association come on board. And what it basically does is it calls for four things: that organisations should invest, maintain and grow their investment in volunteer engagement as we come out of all of this craziness of this year. That we need to be communicating effectively with our volunteers. I know that's something we've talked about on these coffee afternoons over recent weeks as to how we do that, and particularly how colleagues who've been furloughed are expected to maintain those relationships and can't. How we need to be much more adaptable at how volunteers are going to be engaged, and how we need to think in in new and different ways to how we engage volunteers. And a lot of this is stuff that everybody on this call, I know we will all be thinking about anyway, but we may well be lone voices and trying to advocate for that change within our organisations. So the whole purpose of this letter, other than to try and make a bit of a splash in the wider sector, is really something that when you're making that argument within your organisation, and perhaps the board or the senior management team are saying, well, of course you are going to say that, aren't you, because you're wanting to save your job. You can turn around and go, well, it's not just me that's saying it, it's all of these professional associations, all of these peak bodies in the UK are actually calling for the same thing. And I would say it's the first time ever in 26 years I've worked in the field that all of those peak bodies and all of those professional associations have collaborated together on something like this. So it's quite a significant moment for the volunteer engagement field in the UK, I think.
So it's quite a big step for the sector in terms of coming together for bringing it together. And it's quite an easy topic to handle as well. I think one of the key things in talking to a lot of decision makers is not handing them a big wad of paper. It is handing them a concise, clear, almost like as you've done here in the four points. Essentially, investment in volunteer engagement, communication with volunteers, anticipating for greater flexibility in the future, and thinking in new ways. It's quite clear what the letter is advocating for. I don't know if you wanted what you meant by some of these points. So like, what sort of new ways, in terms of new ways, is that new volunteering practices or how organisations are structured?
Yeah, so again, the kind of themes that we've been talking about on these coffee afternoons since kind of March and April around how we've embraced technology in different ways, how we've managed to find new ways of streamlining volunteer engagement and communication with volunteers so that we can make that much easier and much more frictionless. All of the kinds of things could quite easily get thrown out as soon as we go back to, I don't call it the new normal. There's a lyric in a song I heard recently called it the new abnormal. I think that's quite good. But as we get into that, we need to recognize that those ways of doing things, we don't necessarily need to do everything online in future, but some of those things are going to need to change, and we are going to need to recognize that. The fact that, and again, I've talked about this, and some of you may have been on calls where I've talked about this, the whole attitude that we've had to risk, where risk is something to be avoided at all costs, and volunteers are inherently a risky thing because they're unpaid, and we know that if you don't get paid you're more unreliable and you're more untrustworthy, and all of that nonsense that gets talked about. This gives us an opportunity to embrace that, because we're all more aware than ever before that every time we step outside our front door there is a risk in doing that, because the virus has not gone away, it's still around. And so how we adapt and accommodate those things is going to require us to do new ways of thinking and new ways of practice in our organisations. And as the various different heritage sites and galleries and museums and other spaces represented on this call are thinking about opening up, and I know that's a theme we want to return to in future ones of these calls, those decisions are all going to require new ways of thinking. And so volunteering needs to be at the core of that, not an afterthought.
So do you think this crisis is also an opportunity for the volunteering sector to sort of redefine what its position in the heritage sector is, for example? Perhaps realign what its role is?
Absolutely. I think it's going to be completely fundamental. I saw Vanessa had kind of endorsed what I'd said about this other call that we were both just on, which wasn't about the heritage sector. It was about the broader voluntary sector. But frankly, the kind of narrative that was being perpetuated on that was just the same old bore fest that, well, the way we're going to survive is by raising more money from the public and all of this kind of stuff. We are going to go into one of the deepest recessions potentially, hopefully not very long lasting, that we've seen in a very, very long time. Disposable income is going to be plummeting. Lots of people are not going to thrill to giving money to causes in the way that they did before. There's going to be a lot of anxiety about people coming back into our heritage organisations and going into visitor spaces. We've talked about that kind of where those spaces may be charged, and the revenue that we get from shops and cafes is potentially going to be taking a downturn as well. And therefore, if we want to truly maintain our distinctiveness from the private sector, we have to think about different ways of doing things, and engaging the community in that is going to be absolutely fundamental. And one of the most powerful ways we can engage the community is through volunteering. And so we have to embrace that in a very different way. But most of the people that we work with, again, depending on the size of our organization, will not have the level of knowledge or insight or expertise that we all as leaders of volunteer engagement will have. So we've got to step up and use that opportunity to share that with them so that they can make informed decisions rather than stupid decisions.
Yeah. I think it fits in with a lot of narrative within the heritage sector at the moment. Even from the smallest to biggest organization, everyone is talking about becoming hyper-local. Hyper-local seems to become a buzzword within the last few months in terms of how museums plan to rebuild, and volunteering is going to be part of that. The majority of volunteers come from, well, particularly small organizations. They come from within the local community. There's more distance traveling as they get larger, but again, we're going to see more local volunteering. And that sort of community environment is going to be important. That shared goal, which a lockdown did bring to a lot of communities across the country, where people bound together. We saw so many people come together to donate and form local groups, neighbours, and that sort of thing. It's tapping into that sort of ethic and ideology, isn't it?
Yeah, and whether you buy into the theory that we've seen a lot more volunteering in the last few weeks and months, or you buy into the theory that it's not been a lot more volunteering, it's just coalesced, it's a reflection of what was already going on, but it's coalesced around a particular cause, in this case, COVID relief. The reality is that there have been millions of people who hopefully have had an extremely local, very positive, very impactful, and very bureaucracy-free experience of volunteering. And if that has piqued their interest in other forms of volunteering, then we have a massive opportunity to capitalize on that, but not if our approach goes back to pre-COVID days of excessive bureaucracy and risk avoidance and massive risk aversion and long-winded application forms and DBS checks and all of these kinds of things. As you know, let's not do away with safeguarding altogether, but we have to make sure that we're responsive to the way that people want to engage. Otherwise, we'll end up with exactly the same situation that we had after the 2012 Olympics, of massive public awareness and passion about volunteering that then dropped right back down again, and volunteering went to be this hidden thing that everybody in society forgot all about. And in fact, talking to somebody this morning, we're kind of almost seeing that ever since the retail sector opened up on June the 15th. I haven't really thought about it, but he made a very good point that the narrative in the media, the mainstream media, about volunteering and the importance of volunteering in society just seems to have dropped off the radar. It's now about the best thing that we can do is make sure we go out to shops and pubs and restaurants. And that seems to be the thing that we're encouraged to do instead. So yeah, we may have already missed that moment in some respects.
So really, it's key now. We need to take the chance whilst we have it. In terms of your sort of advice, in terms of like who's going to be communicating this, like these letters can go out to managers. In terms of the sort of daily conversations staff members have, like for example, I don't lead the organisation, but I speak to my museum manager regularly. What sort of conversations, what sort of message do you sort of advocate for people like me to use to try and convince and advocate for volunteering?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. It's a point that Rich and I discussed with the group when we were writing this, as to a statement like this, an open letter like this is all very well and good, but what do we do with it? Because there is a sense that to an extent we're preaching to the converted, because hopefully all of you will look at this and go, yeah, I agree with that. And then you try and take it more broadly than that and nobody wants to listen. So I think it is incumbent upon groups like HVG to be sharing this, and Rich and I have had those conversations with others on the steering group, and Rich will probably talk about it a little bit more in a few minutes about the places that we could be taking this to. But I think there is a responsibility or an opportunity for all of us as individuals to definitely share it within our organisations. You know, fire this up to the senior managers, the executive directors, the board, your line manager, make people aware that this exists. If you need to, explain who these organisations are. It's not a long read. If you're part of local networks, whether that's through a local CVS or through a local network of heritage organisations or a regional group through one of the heritage umbrella bodies, share this letter with them, make them aware that it's there. Share it with your volunteer engagement colleagues elsewhere in other organisations locally. Just do as much as you can to push this out, not because we think it's a great way to raise awareness of HVG, although hopefully it will partly do that, but mostly to make sure as many people as possible are aware of and sharing this. You know, if necessary, if you feel so inclined, share it to the local press or the local media when they start talking about reopening. You know, it's a tool. I personally, I think the most value is going to come back on my own days working in organisations on this. The most value is going to come that if you're submitting your strategic plan and funding proposals for the next 6 months, that you slip this across the top, so it's not just you saying this, but it's an endorsement from others to say this is important, this is vital, this is something we should be considering seriously.
Great, thank you, Rob. Rich, in terms as director of Solders of Shropshire, what does this letter mean to you?
I think it's an endorsement of what we've been wanting to do for years. I mean, the profile of volunteering in the sector has been largely taken for granted. Volunteers built our sector, and that's volunteers in the broadest sense. And if you think about volunteers in terms of our supporters, which could be volunteers, workers on the heritage railways, National Trust members, friends, patrons, donors, everybody who supports our organisation, it's just taken as read that if we just keep doing what we keep doing, we'll be all right. And I think for me, this is a huge opportunity to change how we do things, to step up. It's a call to arms, really, and I've been trying to put the document in as many hands as I can of people who matter, but more importantly, been asking for their response and their feedback, because it's great sending it up to someone and thinking, well, they're going to send it on. But if they don't respond to it, if they don't actually warm to it and don't believe in it, it's not going anywhere. So send it up to your management team and your directors and your board, but ask for a response to it. Say I want to know what you're going to do about this. I need to know how to take the next steps in terms of opportunities. We have a very small team of volunteers at the museum. It's growing and has grown under me, as you might expect. But what it says to me is that we've been quite limited in what we've asked them to do to entirely suit our needs at the time. And in terms of making hay while the sun shines, we could really have done with a little bit of notice of this pandemic. I don't know if anyone agrees. A few months or so notice. I could have got stuck into some more online working before Christmas and got that all set up. But if not now, when will we ever get another opportunity to reshape how we engage with volunteers and how we get volunteers engaged with what we do? When are we ever going to be able to ask the deeper questions of what did you do in your former life? What qualifications have you got that actually might be helpful for us now? And start having those conversations with your volunteer teams and have that as an offer for your board and for your managers.
Yeah, that's really good. I think I just want to echo Alexandra's comment in the group chat around sending us to your local museum development network with their wider network across the UK, but also across the museums in that area. That's going to be quite a lot of reach as well, and to sector-wide bodies as well, those organisations which can put their weight onto the argument for this as well is important. And so this open letter has been part of the work HVG has been doing over the last few months in terms of advocacy for the sector and in particular volunteering. I don't know if you want to talk a bit more about the other advocacy work HVG has been doing over the last few months, Rich.
Sure. Well, many of you would have been involved in the survey we sent out. We were asked at quite short notice by the Heritage Alliance and Historic England for our response as to what's required for volunteer support in the sector. Excuse me. We responded very quickly, and thanks to everyone who was able to complete that survey. Over 400 of our members were consulted. And we got a really good picture of where we were, what the attitudes and opinions of the sector looked like. And in response to the draft white paper that they'd sent us, we made some really good sort of critical comments on their terminology and the way they wrote things, but also actually we were able to respond with a really up-to-the-minute snapshot of what our sector was doing. Since then, they've kind of sat on this paper. Not an awful lot has happened, and I think their timing is not governed by them. I think they're waiting for the right moment. But I suppose our regret as an organisation is that we didn't have longer to carry out a more in-depth survey, that we kind of rushed through that in order to meet their deadlines. But it did nonetheless, it told us that, you know, a fifth of our organisations who state very clearly that volunteers are critical to their operation don't even have a volunteer coordinator in post. So we got some really pithy, some really good, powerful advocacy tools there. And in terms of volunteers, organisations not even having a strategy, 40% of organisations don't even have a volunteering strategy. So if that's any of you, get writing now, get it written down. But it enabled us to make sort of 3 key recommendations as well, and that puts us in a very, very strong position as a sector body. And this is echoed by the open letter, that volunteer management must be considered a strategic function. That support should focus on organisations to develop new models of volunteering, not just trotting out the same old traditional roles you've got volunteers doing. And that sectoral change should be driven through our existing networks. And that's you guys, that's all of everyone here today, and your peers and colleagues. And really now is the time to do this. I'm quite excited. I feel very positive about the next few steps. And I know I'm in really good company of people who are doing this really well, and I know they will share it with all of you if you only ask. So if anyone's having any difficulties wading through all this, or any ideas of how they might be able to do it better, well, here's the room. You know, you talk through the chat, getting in touch afterwards, and via the main HVG office. That's my front door. Never mind. Only be
Great. Thank you. I think you're right. I think there's a lot. This is an opportunity to redefine what volunteering is like in the heritage sector. And like, as you said, like you've been experiencing museums closure during your museum's closure during this time. How's that? How have you sort of been in touch with your volunteers? Are you currently planning to? Have you got a date to reopen yet?
We have a very tentative date, which I think is the Saturday, the 18th of July. All things being equal, but we're working alongside the council-run museum so that there's a sort of a synergy locally. Like you said earlier, Will, it's very important to keep in touch with your local peers and your local organisations, because that's how you're going to drive footfall. We're looking at some interesting, clever, maybe not interesting ways, remembering that we have to maintain the whole museum experience through this, and so it's not just about providing sanitisers and increasing that customer confidence. It's about maintaining the experience of visiting a museum as well. So that there's a lot of work going on there. And volunteers feed into this, because volunteers are, after all, some of our main sort of museum users. So we're getting our volunteers in early next week to do a walkthrough with us, and so to identify any spots that we've missed. They're brilliant at that. They're a very good critical bunch. We've got a great WhatsApp group between them all. I think there's only one that's not on it. I have to send him letters, but we've got a good back and forth as to what's happening in everyone's lives, and that everyone's safe and sound and what they can provide. And so, with a small group of volunteers and me looking after them, perfectly manageable. In larger organisations, you have to scale that up somehow, and you maybe have to pick a bunch to come and help. But it's certainly an interesting time, but I see it as a massive opportunity to change things, to tweak things, and one that can only be really taken in little baby steps. If you don't get it right the first time, you've got a bit of time to change it again. And I don't think we should be scared of taking those risks, as Rob said earlier. We should sort of plough on and keep ourselves safe, obviously, but take some organisational risks in what we're doing.
Yeah, it's an interesting time. I agree. I think some of the comments agree as well. How volunteers are often are almost honest critics about our museums. We've definitely had some. We're much further behind you. Being based in Wales, we still don't have a date to know when we can reopen. But we've started getting an idea when volunteers are comfortable returning, and that is going to impact when we choose to reopen, because we know we don't want to reopen before volunteers feel confident, and then trying to understand what measures they would like as well in terms of what makes them feel safe in the museum. And it's quite refreshing to see how much thinking we're doing and how much knowledge also they're willing to share, tapping into their own networks and saying, oh, I saw this, I saw particularly ones who like perhaps are taking the children back to school, for example. They're seeing some of the measures there, or maybe they are teachers on part-time as well, and they're bringing insights such as that. Many volunteers are returning to shops, like the first sector charity retail, and getting experience from there as well. Are there any sort of measures your volunteers are quite keen on introducing, or measures you're keen on bringing?
I think, I mean, if anyone listened to Bernard Donahue, the AIM conference a couple of weeks ago, I think it's available on YouTube. They've done some really good pulse surveys at Alva over the last few months. And what's great about a pulse survey is it's an attitudinal one. It's not so much factual like the ones we send out, but it's like, how do you feel about this? And early on in the pandemic, visitors were very worried about going out at all, let alone to visitor attractions. But as time has moved on and the lockdown has been gradually sort of let up a little and people have got more used to going out, that attitude has changed to having full confidence in our organisations for having all the stuff in place to keep safe, but almost no confidence in other visitors. So I think our volunteers would also echo that they're fine to come back. They trust each other. They trust us. They're just worried about all the other people out there not behaving themselves. And there's actually no evidence that that's going to happen. And we tend to have a reasonably well-behaved bunch that attend museums. And so I think, you know, making sure the volunteers feel safe with all the procedures and the processes and the hardware in place, I think that's going to go hand in hand with how you're going to plan to reopen anyway. But it's about making sure they feel safe from any of the other visitors and our other audiences, and that's a bit more intangible at the moment. So
it's a lot of learning. I've been pricing up.
Take that in small steps as we go.
Now I've been pricing up the sort of like looking at what we need and what we're looking to introduce, whether I'm asking volunteers to wear like a polo top so that they have a changeable outfit, so they don't have to wear any potential same clothing more than one day in a row, and that sort of thing. And gloves, visors, there's a lot of different options at the moment, and we're increasingly seeing, particularly in I would say in a lot of organisations, a move towards visors rather than face masks in a lot of sites, to aid so people aren't as, I guess, potentially intimidating, but also so people can understand what people are saying if you have to read lips, for example, as well. So they're still learning, and hopefully over the next few weeks we'll get an idea of what experiences gained from museums who did open on Saturday. I don't know if many members here are back and volunteers are already back. If you do have any experiences you want to share, please put them in the chat. And I'll just say thank you, Rich, for sharing both what HVG is doing and what your museum is doing. Good luck on opening in less than 2 weeks' time. I'm sure, and it'd be good. I imagine it'd be great to see your volunteers back in person.
Yeah, thank you.
We have a couple of questions coming through now on the chat, so I'm just going to pick a couple out. I got a question relating to Rob's section around. You mentioned changing DBS and safeguarding, and I guess wonder if you could expand on that sort of topic.
Yeah, thanks. Well, thanks for the question, Michelle. Nice question to kick off with. It's sometimes because I'm talking quite quickly on this, I get accused of saying, "Oh well, I'm just throw safeguarding out the window. We don't need to worry about safeguarding ever again." That's not what I'm saying. Please, I do have professional indemnity insurance, but I don't want to rely on it. But what I'm kind of saying with some of the risk things is that quite often organisations have put steps in place around risk management with volunteers that are predicated on assumptions about volunteers and how risky they are because of the way that they go about doing things. So we assume, for example, that because they're not paid, they're going to be presenters with more risky situations. We assume that because they're not paid, they're more likely to make mistakes, all of these kinds of things. And now we all know that's nonsense. That's got nothing to do, you know, if they're incompetent, they're incompetent. It's nothing to do with the fact that they're paid or unpaid. They're incompetent paid and unpaid people. It's a training issue, it's a support issue, it's a recruitment and selection issue. But I think what this what our kind of reopening does is it gives us an opportunity to make those points to people. So one of the aspects of safeguarding is, you know, the virus doesn't discriminate about whether or not the person it infects is paid or unpaid. And therefore, there's no particular things that we have to do with volunteers that are radically different from what we have to do with employees, unless we are open to volunteers from outside the typical age profile of employees, i.e. we're willing to take back people over the age of 70 or under the age of 16 or any of those kinds of things. Some of it is about recognizing that what we tend to do is put a lot of this stuff up front when we're recruiting volunteers, when actually it could be introduced progressively as we bring people on board. So before anybody even gets through the door, they've had to complete a health and safety check, they've had to complete a DBS check, they've had to complete application forms, equal opportunities forms, submit 2 references, etc., etc. Now, that's fine, all of those things may be needed, but do we need them all done by the day we do the first interview? And in fact, there was a really good article which is being done as a guest post on my blog this Friday by a colleague in America who said, not only is all of that throwing up a barrier to volunteering in that respect, but it's also an example of the systemic racism that's inherent in volunteering in the way that we throw barriers up to people right from day one without us even recognizing some of it. And not just racism, but to people with disabilities and all sorts of stuff as well. So it's a really good opportunity for us to rethink what is driving this decision. Is it based on an intelligent thought about risk, or is it being based on a prejudice? And do we have to think differently about when we bring those steps into the process? So why can't we have somebody come in at interview and ask them the questions at interview that we would have asked on the application form, and therefore fill the application form out with them, so that we're not relying on them to have a level of written English that we possibly have, and therefore we're potentially opening ourselves up to a broader range of volunteers as well. So there's all of those kinds of issues that I think we need to be thinking about when it comes to stripping out some of this risk stuff. And also, let's face it, some of the risk has actually been a positive thing. You know, we've taken a risk and done online engagement. That's potentially widened our audience and therefore given us more opportunity to engage people in the future. So it's just thinking about all of these kind of things in a slightly different way. And I agree with the comment Alexandra's already raised on the chat here. You know, you can't just view anybody over the age of 70 as a risk, for example. I know 70-year-olds that are fitter than me in my mid-40s. So, you know, we've got to be flexible and we've got to be personalised in this. And I think for me, that's it. It's taking a personalised, not a process-driven approach. Rich made the point earlier, and I'll end on this, that we think we're going to go back to doing what we've always done, and we'll get what we've always got. I'm increasingly saying, if we do what we've always done, we won't get what we've always got, because the world's moved on from there radically, just in a short period of time.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for the sort of giving clarification on that. And it's an interesting thing, because I often find you put everything in the application form, and when they come in for the interview, there's not actually much to say, because it's all been done already, and then they're there for 5 minutes and then we're done. I think another question we had through is quite different to the previous one. It's around reciprocal entry. It's been quite a big news topic in museums today around organisations such as the Tate temporarily ending any reciprocal entry fee agreements. So, for example, being a member of Museums Association gives you free access to quite a large range of museums across the country. I guess, and how does that impact? Does that impact museums volunteering much? Is that a sign of the type of about tightening we're all expecting to see over the next few months, and whether that really emphasises why it's important now for this letter to be getting out to museums before they start looking at volunteering as something they can easily cut?
Is that me or Rich?
Well, anyone really. I think it's just an interesting point. I guess I go with Rich. You've got a partnership with the local authority, the local museum, council museum.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Do you think these reciprocal things are going to potentially impact how organisations work together in the future, and whether that sort of mindset is going to leak down into that sort of belt tightening scene around like posts and stuff?
I don't think so. I don't think it's not going to be a permanent thing, is it? Is it suggested that it's going to be forever? I think
at the moment it looks like it's temporary.
Yeah, I think playing devil's advocate, it might be a sensible way of being in more control of numbers of people coming into museums, which we've all got to have to do. We're going to be selling prepaid, pre-ordered tickets, so we know what we're dealing with. I think it's a shame if it's always been a privilege. Volunteers and other staff have enjoyed being able to get into other museums, but personally, I think we've got slightly larger problems to look at. And if it's only temporary, then hopefully we can work on getting it reinstated. But maybe it's something we can look at offline and see if there's anything we can do as a group to investigate how long it's going to last.
Yeah, I think especially because I think volunteers often it's interesting because like whenever we talk about volunteering and like memberships, we often find that neither of them, they don't tend to be in both groups, and it's almost in some groups, some reasons for volunteering is instead of like making a financial donation to the museum because they want to keep it open. So there's an interesting dynamic there, but I think it's something which needs to be explored a bit more off here today. It's nice to see different museums coming back. With different levels of volunteering returning. Some are coming back and helping getting museums ready to reopen, such as the RAF Museum. And then others are not coming back. For example, in Bolton Museum, volunteers haven't returned just yet. And they're still sort of getting an idea of when volunteers can return. And I think it often depends on nature of the site and nature of the role of volunteers. Where they're essential, they're going to have to come back earlier, but whether not, they may be seen as something which can bring back later on, or whether they can move to more of a digital platform.
I think, one of the things that's going to be interesting is to see how some of the reopening that we've seen in recent weeks and days could impact in the way that we have to reopen as well. So many of you have probably seen the news coverage today about various different pubs around the country already having to shut. There's a number of issues that are related to that. First of all, we know tests aren't being returned within 48 hours generally. So that therefore means people who were pending test results were deliberately going to pubs when they didn't know if they were infectious or not, which seems to be being missed out of the debate. But the idea that particularly on the lunchtime news today, one publican was being celebrated for the fact that because they had records of who the visitors were to the pub, they were able to act much more quickly than the official track and trace system was to notify people. And that for me raises the question about how many of us are going to make sure, as Rich was just saying then, that we're collecting data on who visits and who's in our premises, if we have premises, in any one particular time, and how quickly we can turn around and share that information should any visitor then notify us subsequently that they've developed symptoms or tested positive. All of these kinds of things we're all going to have to work through and learn from each other as organisations and across sectors over the course of the next few weeks, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a learning curve, and it's might mean museums have to close again because of that risk. Now we'll go into deep clean whilst I'm sure staff are in isolation as required, that sort of thing. Again, that's going to be more issues around statutory sick pay and those sort of things. But I think we'll finish off with final questions today. I think a couple of different members have highlighted how different organisations are being quite demanding on what they expect from their volunteers to complete, like e-learning modules or sign certain forms. Like, I want to get both of your inputs on the sort of expectation of what volunteers are going to need to do to return, whether some organisations perhaps are risking their volunteers returning by expecting them to do quite a lot of paperwork and may take out the side of it which they volunteer for. Do you want to go first, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, without knowing the detail of it, it's hard. I saw the comment from Marina earlier on, picking up about, you know, mandatory training and what have you. I can understand why organisations would want to put things like that in place, and it is trying to potentially make, you know, I'll go from a position of positivity first, that they're probably trying to ensure that the volunteers are protected and that the staff are protected and that the visitors, members of the public, are protected as well. So I can understand why people do that. I mean, Rich was saying about bringing in volunteers back in before you reopen to the public. Other people have said that that could in essence be seen as a form of training and reorientation and reinduction. I don't see any problem with that necessarily. I think where I would have an issue with it is if it's being brought in as a, well, it's okay, we've been through those full training exercises, therefore everybody's safe, without the then follow-up to make sure that everybody's comfortable when they're on site and that everybody's getting the regular support and supervision. I mean, I know from my own experience, my wife went back to working in retail about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and her employer put in place a whole raft of measures, but has made no attempt in the subsequent 2 or 3 weeks to review any of those measures to see whether or not they're actually working and actually protecting people as a consequence. So, you know, if it's a simple box ticking exercise so that people can cover their backsides, then I don't think it's particularly helpful. But if it's being done for the right kind of reasons, then I can understand it. And whilst volunteers may be resistant to it, it's our job to help them to understand why it's important.
Thank you, Rob. Rich, as someone who's planning volunteers coming back, what sort of measures are you planning to put in place to allow volunteers to come back? Are you expecting people to be signing like a document or carrying out any sort of mandatory training?
No, but I'll share all of the risk assessment findings and safe systems of work as I would with the staff that are coming back. I think if you read through the DCMS guidance on reopening, it has huge sections on sharing, communicating your plans, and that's as an important part of writing your risk assessments. Is actually sharing them with the people who will be affected and explaining why. And when people understand why, they're much more on board. If you just blast them with, you must do this, you mustn't do this, you must do that, the shutters go up, they switch off, and they don't listen. So I think engaging in its fullest sense is the best way of doing this, and there's plenty of guidelines for it. Also in the DCMS guidance is preparation to close again, which is very interesting. Anything you have in place now, if you might have to tear it down tomorrow and lock the doors again. So I think sensible, measured steps with everyone on board and everyone communicated to, I think is definitely the way forward. There's no rushing in any of this. There's nobody in any haste to get it sort of open and pretend that everything's fine. So yeah, take small steps, push the boat out a bit with some of your crazy ideas, and keep everyone on board.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rich. And thank you, Rob, as well. Thank you, both of you, for sharing the work you've been doing and advocating for the sector over the last few months. It is really meaningful work, and hopefully leaders in the sector and other sectors will listen to the open letter and value the work of volunteer managers and the value of volunteers themselves.